Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America. I am over here in Des Moines, Iowa, where I'm the Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences and the Director of the Zeta Institute. You can check all of that out at mchs.edu. Bud out there in Pittsburgh, home of the Pirates and maybe the Blue Jays for a summer. What do you do out there, my friend?
I'm here as the Director of the National Institute for Newman Studies. You can find out about our work at newmanstudies.org. And yes, 2 baseball teams, Bo. This time next week, COVID, if COVID stays out of the way, you and I can be making fun of the Cubs again on air.
There's people who are really getting into it, like having countdown clocks and stuff like that. Do you know, is the Blue Jay thing's like a wrap? Like you're going to have a 2 baseball team town in Pittsburgh?
You know, I get most of my news through Twitterverse, which is isn't a
which
reliable.
Is absolutely, obviously true every time you read it. Yes, yeah.
It's not a reliable conduit, but from what I'm reading there, it sounds like a done deal. And I was telling our good friend Ona, who was on the show a few weeks ago, that it'd be hilarious if in September fans are welcomed back to the stadium, and there are more fans at Blue Jays games than Pirates games.
Well,
because they won't have trouble with social distancing at Pirates games.
That's. I've heard that Pittsburgh has decided that of the black and gold teams they're going to put up with shenanigans from, the Pirates are low on the list nowadays.
Yeah, the fan base is pretty cranky. I don't know. I mean, Major League Baseball is kind of a weird sport because you can make a lot of money with having a pretty terrible team. And so I don't follow it real closely, but my humble opinion is that ownership is fine with their profit margins. And so not a lot of urgency to get like a grade A baseball team on the field.
This is where we're going to get the real haters. But I mean, we were joking around. We had one person like on Twitter, a single person, kind of criticizing the show. I think they didn't like my Jaws metaphor more than anything else. But you're going to start bashing the Pirates, and now we really will have like people hating on us.
Yeah, I don't want to alienate it. I think we do have some Pittsburgh listeners now. So next week we'll have to start the show with Steelers talk and how amazing they're going to be this fall.
That sounds good. Well, we always start our show off with gratitude talk, and we want to say thank you to Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting our show, mchs.edu. Well into the middle of the summer semester, getting geared up for the fall semester that is approaching pretty quickly. mchs.edu to find out all the programs that you can look into, the different sort of courses and availabilities that we have. Also to make sure to keep up with how Mercy is being attentive to the COVID situation, making sure that people are prepared to be the next wave of the healthcare industry to reach out to a community in need. Yeah, Bud, you just got done with midterms here in your servant leadership class a while ago, right?
Yeah, that course is going good. And this Monday, I actually sat in on an academic council meeting by Zoom. And I think what struck me is Mercy's still trucking, not being slowed down by anything that's going on around us. So a lot of good things going on there.
They had to like really tone down the anti-Bud Marr talk. They heard you were on. So I heard that's they start out 10 minutes each day talking about. No, it's actually it's all nostalgia. They tell a story. You're becoming a part of like the legend. They tell a story about when Bud was here, and then they get on with their business.
Yeah, it was like old times. You know, everyone got a chance to rib me and give me a hard time. So it felt like 2016 again.
Oh, wow. That seems like 40 years ago.
Oh, man. Yeah.
At some point, we're going to have like a physicist on, and they're going to explain to us how time no longer seems to work by the rules that it should, and see how that all works out.
So real quick, Bo, I know you're kind of a movie buff. Do you have this experience these days where Rachel and I were watching a movie on Tuesday night, and you see human beings interacting like pre-2020, and there's a moment where you're like, like stay away from each other. I don't know.
Well,
we were watching a film, and two bros came up and gave each other like the bro hug, and it made me really anxious.
That's well. So the movies, social distance movie experience that I got to have, I took my most movie buff daughter Stella with me to the drive-in that's over here outside of Des Moines, and they re-showed Empire Strikes Back, which is why she wanted to go. She's a big Star Wars fan, but there was also Jaws. And not only was there not a lot of social distancing on the beach for Jaws, like if it was COVID, there also wasn't a lot of social distancing with the fact that they all knew there was a shark that was causing all sorts of problems. So I just think you would figure that they would be social distancing from the beach a lot sooner in the movie. And yeah, like I said, I made a remark about people's single-mindedness about certain things. So I guess Jaws is indicative of that.
Jaws is a COVID parable, and I probably need to go back to that film, but that's a topic for another day.
That's right. We can have our Jaws episode later. On the show today, we have Dr. Kenneth Craycraft, who's going to come on and talk about religious liberty, both in the minds of the sort of fathers of the United States, but then what we mean by the fathers of the church when we talk about the freedom of religion or religious liberty. So it's going to be a wonderful talk that's going to really dig deep into some issues that I think are increasingly important as we rightfully talk about religious liberty as it comes up in the United States and the worldwide arena, but also what it means when we think about what true religious liberty and freedom is in the church. So you'll want to stick around for this. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Glad you're joining us this Wednesday, but we're going to stick around because we'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the show. We love to have you part of our outreach to talk about the common good and all the issues surrounding such with the church. Glad that you can have us with us. Today on the show, we have Dr. Kenneth Craycraft, an attorney and the James J. Gardner Family Chair of Moral Theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology. He holds a Ph.D. in Moral Theology from Boston College, a J.D. from Duke University School of Law. He also writes a closer look column for the Catholic Telegraph, the monthly magazine of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Ken, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
What comes to mind is why we have you on the show talking about religious freedom. On one hand, it's July. We started out July with July 4th. You have a wonderful article that people can go look on the Catholic Telegraph, a closer look, Religious Freedom is Rooted in Duty, Not Rights, that you put out right before the July 4th holiday. Maybe you were, getting all prepared with the illegal fireworks that were, that everybody in the nation was getting ready. You also have a book, The American Myth of Religious Freedom, that people can check out if they want to. But this idea of what do we mean when we talk about religious freedom or religious liberty, increasingly a topic that comes up not only abroad when we think of places that the plight of Christians and the ability for people to worship freely seems to be in the news more and more, but also in the United States. What do we mean by the free exercise of religion and things like this? So, Ken, I think maybe to start off with, in your mind, when people hear religious liberty and what they think of that means in the American context, you talk about a myth both in your book and in your article. What's the myth in brief, the myth of religious liberty and freedom?
Well, the briefest way that I could describe what I mean by the myth of religious liberty is perhaps to say that there is an understanding that there is available in some sense a way to establish religious freedom such that everyone enjoys the same level of religious freedom and that no one's religious freedom is impinged. There's a myth that there is a politically and morally neutral set of standards that can be implemented such that that everybody experiences religious freedom in the same way. And that's a powerful story. Myth also has, myth has stories and legends and so forth that are built up around them to help to make people believe them and to carry them out. It's a powerful story, but it simply isn't true. it simply isn't the case that there can be any political regime that is completely neutral toward religion. Someone's, as my professor from Boston College, Ernest Borden, was fond of saying, someone's ox is always going to be gored. But in the U.S., we do have this myth, and it's subscribed to from a broad range of people. Now, they think that it has different manifestations and that it should result in different kinds of social institutions and structures. But from the secular left to the religious right, there is a broad subscription to this basic myth. The reason that it simply isn't true, or I should say evidence that it simply isn't true, is manifest in the way that these people from the secular left to the religious right disagree about how religious freedom should be implemented and how it should be exercised or not exercised in the public square. So you have on the one hand religious believers who believe that America is a land of religious freedom in which we should be allowed to exercise our religious belief without impingement from the state or from other people. And on the other hand, we have the secular left, which says that we should be free from exercising religion, but also free from in any way, shape, or form being influenced by or lorded over by, or even having to tolerate the presence of religious belief in the public square. Both of these attitudes are born from the same myth. That is, that there is an epistemologically privileged political philosophy that can establish complete neutrality within the state, and therefore the laws and institutions can be consistent with that. And we see in the religious strife in the U.S. that simply isn't true. So the question then becomes, what does religious freedom? How does religious freedom manifest across the spectrum of different kinds of beliefs? And more importantly, how can we recover a truly authentically Catholic understanding of religious freedom? First of all, within the context of speaking with one another, sort of an ecclesiological definition, and then witness to that definition to the broader public.
And I think that the way, first of all, that is a very succinct way to put that. I think we should just package that last bit. That was really good. And I think precisely that this goes back to the fact that all of the words involved in our discussion can have radically different meanings, not only to different people, but also just within the church and the discussion of those words throughout time. Religious liberty. So what is religion primarily, in the sort of thoughtscape of people today, and it has to do with the stuff of prayer, or we go to church, right? It's a set of beliefs. The idea that religion used to be seen as like a group of people, right? The religious, as opposed to the laity, or the or even going back further, and that religion is at the heart of justice, right? That religion is that realm of justice owed to God. You start to talk about the differences and the layers about what we mean with the word religion. Then you go over to liberty, where it funny enough, is probably even more of the Wild West, to make a bad pun, about what we mean. What does it mean to be free to do things or free from things? I think the very nature of the term can be broken down into extremely important discussion points. But for whatever reason, we put the two words together, religious liberty or religious freedom. And like you said, there's an assumption that there's this package deal that we all agree on until we actually get into the details.
Yeah, it's very well said. We're all familiar with whether we call it the incommensurability thesis or whatever we call it. Basically, we are in a post-Alasdair MacIntyre world, or in an Alasdair MacIntyre world, and so we recognize, it's almost a given that we recognize the problem of the incommensurability of moral languages across traditions, whether they be linguistic traditions, and recognizing that does not in any way commit us to any kind of relativism or subjectivism. Obviously, there is a subjectivist element to many rationalities of discourse that are out there competing among these incommensurate languages. But when we think about the inability to communicate what we mean by freedom or by religion, one of the things I tell my students is what we're doing there is we're giving reasons for what we believe, and therefore trying to make a rational argument. But if the person that we're speaking with doesn't agree that what we believe are reasons are truly reasons, then we sound irrational, and they sound irrational to us, because that's what a rational argument is: two interlocutors agreeing on what counts as a reason to do or say or hold something. And if one of the interlocutors doesn't even agree that that is a reason to believe or hold or this position, then we have a breakdown in rational language at the very outset. And that's exactly what we see when we talk about religious freedom. I believe with Evelyn Waugh and others that all conflict is ultimately theological, and all politics is ultimately theological, which is to say that you can't separate at least theological positions from any kind of political regime or any kind of regime of laws. The law has to take account of religion. The question is, what account of religion does it take? And therefore, all laws and all political regimes necessarily are religious. The question isn't whether or not they're religious. That's a given. The question is what they do with religion, and that's where the conflict begins. So you're exactly right. If we can't even agree with one another across these incommensurate linguistic communities, if you want to call them that, what counts as freedom or what counts as religion, then it's a very, very difficult to have conversations. To make it worse, we have. Go ahead.
No, please keep going. To make it worse. Sorry about that.
To make it worse, we have in the U.S., we have a Supreme Court jurisprudence which is hopelessly muddled and confused and confusing, issuing contradictory opinions, or opinions which are going to be contradicted down the road because they adhere to different ways of thinking about religious freedom. And we can perhaps talk about this term, in fact, as a perfect example of what's going to happen this Supreme Court term on several opinions that impinge upon or that speak to religious liberty either directly or indirectly, but which set the tone for a next term and terms that follow for some very serious conflict, both in popular culture and in First Amendment or religious freedom jurisprudence.
Ken, my apologies for trying to jump in there too quickly. Bud
No
Marr,
problem.
my own area of expertise is the theology of St. John Henry Newman, and religious liberty is one of the locus classicus for this idea of development of doctrine, which he wrote so much about. I was wondering, so you'll sometimes hear, I think maybe from those outside the church who are concerned about her influence on culture or politics, they'll say, like, the Catholic Church pre-1960s, it was completely opposed to this idea. And you look at the papal magisterium from like Pius IX until Pius XII, and all these condemnations of religious liberty. And then at Vatican II, something very different happens. And now, especially in American Catholicism, you'll get these movements on the parts of bishops, like the Fortnight for Freedom. And I think to some non-Catholic, it feels kind of like a sleight of hand. Like, it was convenient for the church to be in this place for a time, and then when it felt itself embattled or maybe in a minority status, that it flipped. And I was wondering if you could talk to our listeners about how do we think about the history of this teaching and the idea of development of doctrine when it comes to especially what popes have said across time about these issues.
Yeah, well, I, first of all, as far as Dignitatis Humanae Personae goes, that is the Vatican II Declaration on Religious Liberty. In my generous moments, I say that there is some very significant tension within the document that is very difficult to work through. In my less generous moments, I say that there is some contradiction going on there. And I think that but I'm generous. I'm feeling generous today. So there's tension in it, and the tension is manifest in the way that you even pose the question. To be sure, we do have, and I can also understand why people would take the position that now that especially in the U.S. when Catholics were a minority and they needed the protection of vigorous protection of religious liberty, which was threatened not just on the popular level but even on the legal level by things like Blaine amendments in state constitutions and so forth, and therefore champion religious liberty when it was convenient for us, but were not so hot about it when, like in Catholic Europe or what have you. I think the issue here goes to what we mean by where we seat religious liberty. Is it seated in the subjective individual, or is it seated in the church as an institution? And we can argue that religious freedom is seated in the church as an institution and still have a broad provision for the rights of non-Catholic Christians or non-Christians or anyone else to have a free exercise of conscience and therefore to the freedom to dissent, because the freedom of the church itself is rooted in the dignity of the human person. So you know more about the development of the doctrine of religious liberty than I do, to be sure, and of course you know much more about Newman's own notion of development. But if you take Newman's idea of the idea, you take Newman's idea of the idea, and if the idea is of freedom of religion is the freedom of the church to exercise its role, to name its mission and to execute that mission, is the way that I like to put it. So that we have to understand the freedom of the church as the church's freedom to name its mission without impingement from the state and to exercise that freedom without impingement from the state. Now, Dignitatis Humanae even goes so far as to say that nothing is inconsistent with religious freedom if a state even assists the church in that mission, which is an underlooked passage. But if we take that basic idea, that idea can persist both in a regime that allows a broad range of dissent and that is more pluralistic, and one that is less pluralistic and more that looks more like a confessional state. Now, I'm not advocating a confessional state, but I am saying that Dignitatis Humanae Personae does not preclude the possibility of the legitimacy within the document itself of a confessional state. That obviously isn't going to happen in North America. Something like that seems to be, or more like that seems to be happening in some parts of Europe, perhaps Poland, perhaps Hungary. But the fact is, the idea of religious liberty seated in the church doesn't preclude, and I don't believe ever has precluded, the possibility of dissent. Now, we could, obviously, historians will raise all kinds of objections that whether it does or doesn't. The fact is that non-Catholic Christians face times of difficulty, to put it mildly, when Catholics were in charge. But that actually brings us to a more basic and important question, and that has to do with what we do with political authority and what the relation of the church is to political authority, which is a slightly different question, of course, than the question of religious liberty. I know that was probably a long answer that wasn't even an answer, but that's sort of the way that I would react to it.
No, I actually think what starts to be interesting about the whole discussion is the fact of the matter illustrates your point. What I mean by this is, so Dr. Russell Hittinger, big influence on my life, when he talks about Dignitatis Humanae, he's usually pointing out the sort of way in which Catholic social teaching doesn't come down from the skies as a sort of fully formed system. It's much more like St. Paul talking about different situations, right? This is what Corinth is going through. This is what Galatians is going through. It's not that any of it contradicts, but certainly the different letters have different emphasis. So you look through the history, right? Like, so Pius IX, who is a prisoner in the Vatican, has very different social realities that he's addressing. Leo XIII, we go through, right? Up until we get Dignitatis Humanae, which is really talking about post-communist Europe after everything that happened with World War II. But Americans, and not like to sort of like make this like it invalidates how we think about things, but when we talk about liberty and freedom, it's the one, we have a stunning ability to mean it in a completely individualistic way, but then also a completely idealistic universalist way, right? So like liberty and freedom is either like what I want to do right now which bag of Skittles I should buy, or
Yep.
it's this topic that is just sort of spiritual in a Platonic form. This idea that there's going to be nuances talking about depending what you're doing, because the church itself is a living society that has to address these things. I think that is something that can make it sound like, Bud was pointing out, that we can be shifty because the circumstances come up. But it's actually being honest about being a living community throughout time, responding to things. We only have 2 minutes before we hit the break, but I guess just on that note, do you think that sometimes is some of the difficulty you have when you're talking to people about this concept?
Oh, I certainly do, because no matter how we look at the issue, we're always going to be looking at it from a perspective. As I tell my students, there's no such thing as an abstract morality. We can talk about moral theories and moral foundations and fundamental moral notions, but the fact is, when it comes down to our moral lives, morality is about human action, and human action is always going to be perspectival. Again, this doesn't commit us to any kind of relativism, but the fact is, we make moral decisions from certain perspectives, the perspectives that we can see. And so when we think about religious freedom, it always is going to be affected by, if not even sometimes overdetermined by, the particularities of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So the question for us as Catholic moral agents is how we use our moral agency, not to change what we can't change, but rather to take those contingencies, apply moral agency to those contingencies, and to mold a consistent ethic of religious liberty or freedom more generally, such that we're consistent and thinking with the church on the one hand, but on the other hand also taking into consideration the contingencies that are thrust upon us. So our moral agency isn't simply about the ability to choose A instead of B, but rather what we do when we would prefer A, but instead we have B. What do we do with B? And that's where we think about perspective and contingency and so forth. And there's where we find true liberty. Not when we're frustrated that we can't choose A, but when we can't choose A and B is thrust upon us, how we use our agency to incorporate that into an understanding of the Catholic moral life.
Oh, this is fascinating stuff. I'm so glad that we're getting to dive into this here, like I said, in July, for people to think about. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, speaking with Dr. Kenneth Craycraft. We'll be back right after these messages. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for coming and listening to the show. We love having you here. On the show today, we have Dr. Kenneth Craycraft, attorney, and James J. Gardner, family chair of moral theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology, Ph.D. in moral theology from Boston College, J.D. from Duke University School of Law. You can check out his work at A Closer Look. That's on the CatholicTelegraph.com. And he wrote the book, The American Myth of Religious Freedom, which is right in the wheelhouse of what we're talking about today. Ken, thank you for coming on the show again.
Oh, thanks again for having me. I'm enjoying it.
So, Ken, religious liberty, I'm frankly amazed about how we were able to really cover a lot of the basics in 20 minutes. The answers you gave, people should go back and listen to on our podcast if they have any questions about the basics. What I think this sort of ends up when the rubber hits the road is people want to ask, okay, so what ramifications does that start to look like for Catholics in day-to-day life in 2020?
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that, you guys who read too many books are worried about, and this really doesn't have any sort of implications for us? Oftentimes when religious liberty ends up being told like this is an issue that parishioners care about, to not try to put it too maliciously, it can sound like a setup to then be like, so here's this candidate you should follow, or here's this political program, or here's this party. In your work in this field, I guess the first question is, what do we hope Catholics who, okay, now maybe I have a better understanding that our understanding of religious liberty doesn't match, at least doesn't match perfectly, if not more adversarial than that, the sort of myth that goes on about it. What do we see as practical steps forward? Like, oh, now as a parishioner who knows this, my life will be different. How?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I want to go underneath the question just a little bit before I try to address it directly. And that is the very problem of Catholics thinking in terms with a Catholic vocabulary and a Catholic rationality. One of the problems with the what I call the liberal myth of religious freedom is that we Catholics, and I say this even about myself because we all have these tendencies, as I tell my students, we get liberalism with our mother's milk. And even cradle Catholics oftentimes are raised in such a way that without even realizing it, our moral impulses are more formed by the stories and myths of liberalism than they are by the stories and myths of Catholicism. And unfortunately, that affects the way that we think, not just about political freedom, but also freedom within the church. So we tend to bring this idea of this radical subjective individualist notion of religious freedom even into the church, which of course within the church we call that dissent, or which gives rise to what we call cafeteria Catholics and so forth. So the first task, and I take this as sort of the part of the broad new evangelization that we talk about so much, in which in my Archdiocese of Cincinnati, our Archbishop is very strongly committed to, and to his credit, is first of all doing exactly that, trying to, and I do with my students, and I hope my seminary students take this to their parishes, first of all, trying to get us Catholics to speak Catholic and to think Catholic to one another, and therefore to be a witness to the broader community. Now, let's imagine that we are able to make some headway in that category in the first place, so that we think more about the freedom of the church. Then how does that apply in the broader community? Well, first of all, when we think about the freedom of the church and the freedom of the individual, we always have to recognize and remember that there isn't any that religion itself is a virtue. So the practice of religion is the practice of virtue. And virtue requires the ability to make the wrong choice. In order to be truly virtuous, or to make a moral decision, we have to be free not to make that decision. We can't be coerced. We can't make it out of fear, and all of those other things that St. Thomas called the enemies of voluntariness. So it has to be free and voluntary. And that's a staple of Catholic thought. That doesn't commit us to any kind of subjectivist notion or individualist notion of religious freedom, but it does tell us that in order to make an authentic moral choice, the choice has to be free. And therefore, as Catholics, using the language of Catholic morality, not of liberal political theory, but of Catholic morality, we recognize that the virtue of religion requires the ability to make a free choice, a choice that's unconstrained by fear, coercion, passion, and so forth. And if we can even learn to do that, that gives us an ability to speak in the public arena that's very different from the way that we typically speak now. And it also gives us the foundation for a broader, and I believe, more hopeful understanding of religious liberty, because it isn't about the freedom not to believe, but rather it's about the moral dignity of the person, for whom the ability to make the choice is itself a part of the moral fabric of religious liberty. So when we think about, so for example, a person, and then the second part of your question is, when we think about partisan politics and religious freedom, one of the things that worries me the most, and I worry about this all the time actually, is the way that we Catholics tend to define our moral lives, not even by political liberalism, but rather by partisan identification. And I know, though I know you a little bit better than I know Bud, but I know that you are attuned to resisting the identification with one party or the other, because a Catholic social doctrine simply doesn't fit with one party or the other. And therefore, even though we might find ourselves agreeing with the policy positions of one party or another, we have to strongly resist being identified with that party as partisan. I tell my students, I want you to be Catholic social doctrine Catholics, not liberal Catholics or conservative or Democrat or Republican, but Catholic social doctrine Catholics. And that applies to the way we think and speak about religious liberty, because it's rooted not in the subjective individualist notion, but rather in the very idea that religion itself is a virtue, which requires the ability of the person to act freely. And then when we think about the church, we think about the church as this institution, which again is permitted to name its mission and to execute that mission, and without impingement from forces outside it. If Catholics can start thinking about religious freedom in those two ways, I think it can have both a salutary effect on the way that Catholics worship and pray, and secondly, the way that the church witnesses to the broader public, the non-Catholic or non-Christian public, about a more hopeful way of thinking about religious liberty, which preserves what we call political freedom, but which also sustains in a more hopeful and foundational way a truly and authentically Catholic idea of religious liberty rooted in principles of Catholic social doctrine.
Ken, when I first started studying some of these issues and reading figures like John Milbank and Stanley Hauerwas, what blew my mind was kind of the demythologizing of that story that you've been saying liberalism tells, and especially this idea that there's just simply not this secular realm that's cordoned off from superstition and that's morally neutral, where everyone can sort of pursue their own understanding of happiness without bumping into each other. This actually, funny enough, came up. I was doing some social distanced socializing a couple weeks ago over some pints, and I was talking about some of these matters, and I must have been doing a poor job, because those around me, like, what they heard or what their concerns was, doesn't this inevitably slide into like theocracy or fascism? Maybe I come off as a fascist in social circles, but like as you talk about these things with students and maybe like Catholics in the pews, what do you say when the response is sort of like, well, the virtue of liberalism is that we don't get, I don't know, whichever boogeyman in the past, like Franco or Mussolini or whatever?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, there are two ways of addressing the question. The first one is to address the last thing that you said. The fact is, it's becoming manifest that we are seeing liberalism becoming something like, or at least having tendencies, or what's the word I want, symptoms that look a lot more like fascism than liberalism. I mean, the cancel culture and so forth. All of this stuff is from the left. These are liberal values that are becoming manifest in the so-called cancel culture. So, but that point actually is an important one in going to the other part of the answer to your question, and this is the myth that really needs to be exploded in the most profound way, that liberalism, that political liberalism, is a neutral set of religious or of political principles, and that simply is not true. So you mentioned Milbank and Hauerwas, and Hauerwas has had a tremendous influence on my own development and thought, and he's a good friend. Also Adrian Vermeule at the Harvard Law School has written on this lately, and others as well. And the point is this: there is no such thing as liberalism. Stanley Fish wrote a book many years ago called "There's No Such Thing as Free Speech," and it's a good thing too. The last chapter of my book, I forget exactly the title, but I call it something like "There's No Such Thing as Religious Freedom." I think that's what it is. And I could even make it broader and say that there's no such thing as liberalism. Liberalism, by its own definition, doesn't exist. That is to say, there isn't any such thing as a neutral set of purely procedural political principles which don't have any view of the common good, because that itself is a view of the common good. Now, it's a perverse, truncated, and highly deficient view of the common good, but there isn't any such thing as a set of political principles that don't have in view some collective or some common good. The common good might be the vision of common good might be faulty, but it's there, which is another way of saying that all political philosophy, including political liberalism, is a substantive view of the good. And so, to go back to your question, we're not when we say that we think that a Catholic vision of the good would be a better way for society to function. We're not saying anything different from someone like Locke or Madison or Jefferson when they say a liberal conception of the good. Now, of course, they won't say a liberal conception of the good, but in fact, that's exactly what is being instituted. And so what I would say is that it isn't any different. It isn't any different in its theoretical foundations. It's only different in the good that fills the so-called void, because there is no void. Every politics, every political theory has a view of the good, including, and most importantly, including liberalism.
You know, Ken, this is probably way too big of a bag of worms to open up. We only have about 6 or so minutes, but what's funny, where I start seeing weird overlaps with this sort of stuff. So liberalism, you know, Stanley Hauerwas, all of us had him as a professor. Liberalism is the story you tell yourself when you say you have no story, and
right.
and
Yep.
you see that with. And when we mean liberal, we do not mean Democrats. Democrats, Republicans, this is a shared myth that there's
Correct.
this sort of, like you said, this neutral, bureaucratic artifice that then allows us to pursue these other things in the quote unquote private sphere. And so you get this notion of the good that tries to hide its notion of the good behind a neutrality, a bureaucratic neutrality. Mm-hmm. Weirdly enough, if you think about this, just throwing out 3 other sort of visions of the good, there's countless more, but just to throw them out. The Catholic one, the communist one, and the fascist one. Funny enough, liberalism shares with fascism an appeal to a neutrality or a naturalism, because the fascists all say, well, this is just the people, right? This is the vox populi, or this is the natural way that the German people act, or the this people that or that. It's weirdly enough, the Catholics and the communists will at least admit that, like, no, we're trying to take over because there's a substantive good that we think that you have to fight over. And so it starts to be interesting, right, that if you start to look through history, that a lot of fascist regimes are preceded not by Catholic or communist ones, but by liberal regimes, because of how powerful and potent the neutrality myth is. So I'm not trying to say that liberals end up being fascist. I know that would be like truly like throwing a lot of gasoline on the fire, but just so people don't think that like there's not a cost to the neutrality. It's true that for a while, when you have a sort of neutral myth, you can do live and let live for a while, but it ends up being live or let die, because these conflicts, as we are starting to see, can't be hidden forever. And I said, I know we have like 4 minutes left, so that's a huge topic, but I think that's part of the importance of trying to get Catholics to see this.
So that listeners aren't confused and don't get upset by it. And when I talk about liberalism, I'm talking about the political philosophy that's held by the most conservative Republican all the way to the most liberal Democrat. That's what I mean when I say liberalism. When I say liberalism or liberals, I'm not talking about adherents to or members of the Democratic Party. I'm talking about this American ethos that is agreed to across that spectrum. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, you're exactly right. And this is the problem. Liberalism is a story that is simply not compatible with or consistent with the way that we live our practical moral lives, and because we don't live our lives and as though there's a neutral principle. We don't live our lives. If we take Rawls as the quintessential liberal with his veil of ignorance, yes, it's a wonderful ivory tower moral experiment. But the fact is, that's not how we live our moral lives. And when we think about neutral sets of procedures by which we are allowed, that any vision of the good is allowed to flourish, that simply is not. It's simply not the way that we live. We have moral commitments that transcend this. I think it was Alasdair MacIntyre who said that dying for liberalism is like dying for the telephone company or something like that. Our moral commitments are much thicker than that, and our thick moral commitments resist notions of political neutrality, even while we champion philosophies of political neutrality, because we do live thickly constituted lives. We don't live simply bureaucratic lives. And when we want to exercise those thickly constituted lives in the public arena, then liberalism finds itself wanting. And to put it in the way of a very popular book over the last couple of years, at least popular in academic circles, Why Liberalism Failed. Part of Patrick Deneen's thesis is precisely that the way that we constitute our lives simply isn't consistent with these notions of political neutrality, in which any vision of the good is able to flourish without any kind of nod to or acknowledgement of the thickly constituted ways that our moral lives are ordered.
And I think, folks, we're ending up here, but what's important to realize, and this is setting off a sort of like bigger history. We're sort of throwing back to what Brandon McGinley brought up on the show last week. A lot of this is not like, oh, well, the Catholics see this clearly, and then this is what these liberals are off doing. This is part and parcel about how a lot of the church has operated for decades, because the church in America, so worried about being in their Catholic ghettos, really sold, their birthright for pottage in order to be able to okay, well, we'll be neutral too if we get to play the game. And we're living through the bill, coming due.
Amen.
And so, folks, you're going to have to be okay with people not liking some of your contention of what the good life is. There is not a future where we can have a substantive discussion with all these different groups and remain Catholic and not cause friction. And so that to me, even just in the American life, right? When sometimes I think people castigate different groups because they're bringing up uncomfortable conversations. This goes from BLM all the way up to discussions about COVID. But the way forward, folks, is to be able to bear the cross of those difficulties, not retreat back into this neutrality that's never existed. Ken, we've run out of time. This is fantastic. We're going to have you back on the show soon, because there's so much more to talk about.
I'd love to.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
That's Dr. Kenneth Craycraft, attorney, and James Gardner, family chair of moral theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology. You can check out his work at the Catholic Telegraph. He writes a closer look essays for that. And then also, like we said, his book is The American Myth of Religious Freedom. Folks, this is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, our city, our state, the world, the solar system, the galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.